Okay, so here's something that's going to mess with your head. Right now, at this exact moment, we're living in an ice age. Yeah, seriously, not joking. We're technically in one right now, been going on for about 2.6 million years. But the really wild part? Every 100,000 years, like clockwork, our planet goes through this insane transformation where massive ice sheets cover huge chunks of the continents, then they melt away again. 100,000 years, over and over. So why 100,000 years? What's so special about that number? Turns out it's got everything to do with how Earth wobbles through space, and the story of figuring this out is actually pretty incredible. Hey, likes and subscribes keep these going, so yeah. Where's everyone at right now? Drop your city and time. Got a comment from someone in Zurich at 7 a.m. saying good morning, right under someone in San Diego saying good night. The internet's weird, but kind of amazing. But before we get into the science, let me tell you what this cycle actually creates. Because when Earth tips into a full glacial period, the planet becomes home to some of the most bizarre and magnificent creatures that have ever existed. We're talking woolly mammoths trudging through frozen grasslands, giant ground sloths digging tunnels the size of your house, and saber-toothed cats hunting prey that weighed several tons. This 100,000-year cycle literally shaped the evolution of life on Earth for millions of years. And get this, about 10,000 years ago, most of these incredible animals just vanished, gone. The cycle shifted, ice melted, and suddenly the megafauna that had dominated the planet for hundreds of thousands of years couldn't make it. We're still trying to figure out exactly why. Climate change? Humans? Both? The debate is still raging. So in this video, we're going to break down this 100,000-year cycle, how it works, why it happens, what kind of world it creates during the cold phases, and what happens when it shifts back to warm. You're going to meet the creatures that thrived in Ice Age conditions. Learn how humans survived and adapted, and understand why it all came crashing down so recently. And at the end, we'll talk about where we are in the cycle right now and what that means for our future. Let's start with the basics. An ice age isn't just a cold period, it's an extended chunk of time, we're talking millions of years, where Earth's temperature drops enough that massive ice sheets and glaciers take over large portions of the planet's surface. And we're currently in one, the Pleistocene Ice Age, which kicked off about 2.6 million years ago, and technically hasn't ended yet. Now, within any ice age, you get fluctuations. There are glacial periods where it's really frozen and interglacial periods where it warms up. We're in an interglacial period right now, have been for about 11,700 years. So when people say the Ice Age, they usually mean the last glacial period, which lasted from about 115,000 years ago to 11,700 years ago. That's when the ice sheets were at their biggest and the megafauna were running the show. During that last glacial period, the temperature was only about 6 degrees Celsius colder than today on average. 6 degrees doesn't sound like much, right? But we're not talking about 6 degrees in one spot. We're talking about 6 degrees worth of thermal energy being sucked out of the entire planet. All the oceans, all the land masses, the whole atmosphere. That's enough to completely transform the world. Huge ice sheets covered most of Canada and northern Europe. The Laurentide ice sheet in North America and the Fennoscandian ice sheet in Europe were kilometers thick in some places. Because so much water was locked up in ice, sea levels dropped by over 100 meters. You could walk from England to France. You could stroll from Asia to Alaska across what's now the Bering Strait. The coastlines were completely different. And the landscape? Mostly tundra and cold grasslands, dry and windswept, nothing like the forests we see today. So what caused this? Why does Earth go through these dramatic swings every 100,000 years? The answer starts with this Serbian scientist named Milutin Milankovic. This guy, back in the early 1900s, figured out something nobody else had really considered. What if ice ages weren't caused by anything happening on Earth, but by changes in Earth's position relative to the Sun? See, Earth's orbit isn't perfectly circular, it's slightly elliptical, and the shape of that ellipse changes over time because of gravitational pulls from other planets, mainly Jupiter and Saturn. Sometimes our orbit is more circular, sometimes it's more stretched out. And this cycle of changing from circular to elliptical and back takes about 100,000 years. That's the first Milankovitch cycle, called eccentricity. When Earth's orbit is highly elliptical, the distance between Earth and the Sun varies more dramatically throughout the year. This affects how much solar radiation hits different parts of the planet at different times. And here's the crucial part. It's not about how much total sunlight Earth gets. It's about where and when that sunlight hits. Northern Hemisphere summers are the key because that's where most of the land is. If Northern Hemisphere summers are cool enough that winter snow doesn't fully melt, the snow sticks around. Year after year, it piles up. Eventually, you've got ice sheets forming, and once ice sheets start growing, they reflect more sunlight back into space, which cools things down even more, which allows more ice to form. It's a runaway feedback loop. But eccentricity isn't the only cycle. There's also obliquity, which is the tilt of Earth's axis. The more tilted Earth is, the more extreme the seasons. This tilt varies on a roughly 41,000-year cycle. When Earth is less tilted, the difference between summer and winter is milder, which means summer might not be warm enough to melt all the winter ice. Ice accumulates. Ice age begins. The third cycle is precession, or wobble. Earth wobbles on its axis like a spinning top that's starting to slow down. This wobble changes which hemisphere is tilted toward the Sun during different parts of the orbit, and it happens on a 26,000-year cycle. This affects the contrast between seasons. Right now, the Northern Hemisphere has winter when Earth is closest to the Sun, so northern winters are milder than they would be otherwise. But during other parts of the precession cycle, that flips and Northern Hemisphere winters can be much colder. When you combine all three of these cycles, eccentricity, obliquity, and precession, they work together to control Earth's long-term climate. And here's what's weird. The 100,000-year eccentricity cycle is actually the weakest of the three in terms of how much it changes incoming solar radiation. The other two cycles should matter more. But when scientists started drilling cores out of ocean sediments and ice sheets to reconstruct past climate, they found that the dominant pattern is 100,000 years. The weak cycle somehow dominates the whole system. This is called the 100,000-year problem, and scientists are still trying to fully explain it. The leading idea is that there are feedback mechanisms that amplify the eccentricity cycle. Maybe it takes a long time to build up ice sheets, but they can collapse relatively quickly. So the system spends most of its time slowly building ice during the cool phases of the cycle, then rapidly melts when conditions shift to warming. This asymmetry could explain why the 100,000-year pattern shows up so strongly. But here's what we know for sure. For the past million years or so, Earth has been going through these 100,000-year climate cycles. Slow buildup of ice over tens of thousands of years, then relatively rapid melting, then another slow buildup. And during the cold phases, the world became a stage for some of the most incredible animals ever to walk the planet. The megafauna. that's what we call them. And the word mega is no exaggeration. Some of these creatures weighed 4,500 kilograms or more. There are theories about why everything got so big during ice ages. One idea is Bergmann's rule, which says that in cold climates, mammals tend to be larger because a bigger body has a lower surface area to volume ratio. Less surface area relative to volume means less heat loss, so bigger bodies stay warm more efficiently in the cold. That's why polar bears are bigger than other bear species and why Ice Age mammals tended toward the gigantic. But size alone doesn't tell the whole story. These animals had incredible adaptations for surviving in a frozen world, and the most famous one, the poster child of the Ice Age, is the woolly mammoth. Woolly mammoths weren't actually as huge as you might think. They were about the same size as modern elephants, maybe a bit shorter, but they were built completely differently. They had thick, shaggy fur with 2 layers, a dense underwool, and longer outer guard hairs. This coat could be up to a metre long in places and provided insulation so good that mammoths could handle temperatures of -40 degrees or colder. They also had small ears to minimise heat loss, unlike modern elephants with their big floppy ears used for cooling off, and they had a layer of fat up to 9 centimetres thick for extra insulation and energy storage. Their skulls were specially shaped too, with large sinus cavities that helped warm and humidify the cold, dry air before it reached their lungs. Breathing in super cold air can damage your lungs, so this was a crucial adaptation, and their teeth were perfect for grinding the tough grasses and sedges that grew on the mammoth steppe, this unique cold grassland ecosystem that covered huge areas during glacial periods. As their teeth wore down, new ones would move forward from the back of the jaw. A mammoth would go through 6 sets of teeth in its lifetime. We know so much about mammoths because some have been found frozen in permafrost, almost perfectly preserved with fur, skin, and even stomach contents intact. Scientists have studied what they ate, extracted their DNA, and found that they had special hemoglobin variants that worked better in the cold, allowing their blood to deliver oxygen more efficiently in freezing temperatures. These animals were fine-tuned for Ice Age conditions. But mammoths weren't alone. The Ice Age world was packed with megafauna. Woolly rhinoceros roamed the same landscapes, covered in thick fur with massive horns that could reach over a metre long. They used these horns to plough through snow to reach vegetation underneath. Giant ground sloths lived in the Americas, and these weren't the cute little tree sloths we know today. Some species weighed several tons and could stand up to 4 meters tall on their hind legs. They were too big to climb trees, so they lived on the ground, feeding on vegetation and, incredibly, digging burrows. We've found their burrows, tunnels up to 40 meters long, with claw marks on the walls that match their fossilized claws perfectly. There were glyptodonts, basically car-sized armadillos with shells made of fused bone plates. They couldn't roll up like modern armadillos, but they didn't need to. Their shells were tough enough to stop most predators, and some species had club-like tails covered in bony spikes that they could swing as weapons. Recent studies suggest they might have been able to rear up on their hind legs, which means you could have had these armoured tanks standing upright and swinging spiked clubs. That's both awesome and terrifying. And then there were the predators. Saber-toothed cats prowled the Americas with canine teeth up to 18 centimeters long, curved like daggers. They used these to deliver killing bites to the throat or belly of prey, causing massive bleeding. Cave lions in Europe and Asia were larger than modern lions. Giant short-faced bears in North America might have been the largest mammalian land predators ever, standing over 3 meters tall on their hind legs. Dire wolves hunted in packs and had more powerful jaws than modern wolves, perfect for crushing bone. This was the world the 100,000-year cycle created during its cold phases, a frozen planet inhabited by giants, and for hundreds of thousands of years this cycle just kept repeating. Ice sheets grow, megafauna thrive, ice sheets melt, forests expand, then it all happens again over and over. But about 11,700 years ago, something different happened. The ice melted like it had before, but this time most of the megafauna didn't make it through. Within a few thousand years, they were gone, and we're still trying to understand why the cycle that had sustained them for so long suddenly failed them. Was it because the warming happened too fast? Was it because humans, who had been evolving and spreading during these cycles, had finally developed the technology and numbers to hunt these animals to extinction? Or was it some combination of both? Coming up, we're going to dive deep into what actually happens during one of these 100,000-year cycles. What does the planet look like at peak glaciation? How do these megafauna survive? And most importantly, what triggers the transition from glacial to interglacial? And why did it spell doom for so many species this time around? Alright, so let's drop into the last glacial maximum about 20,000 years ago. This is when the 100,000-year cycle hit its coldest point. Ice sheets at their absolute peak, and the world, nothing like today. I mean nothing. Picture this, ice sheets covering all of Canada, reaching down into what's now the northern United States. Ice up to 3 kilometers thick in some places. 3 kilometers? That's stacking the Burj Khalifa, tallest building in the world, on top of itself more than 3 times. Except, it's not steel and glass. It's solid ice covering an area the size of a continent. The weight of all that ice was so enormous it actually pressed down on the Earth's crust beneath it, deforming the solid rock. Europe had its own massive ice sheet, the Fennoscandian, blanketing Scandinavia, the Baltic, parts of Britain and northern Russia. Between these two ice sheets, you're looking at maybe 15 million cubic kilometers of ice sitting on land. To put that in perspective, if you took all that ice and spread it evenly over the entire land surface of Earth, it would be about 100 meters deep everywhere. It's an almost incomprehensible amount of water, frozen solid. And with all that water locked up on land, sea levels dropped, not by a few meters, by 120 meters. That's as tall as a 40-story building. Coastlines extended way beyond where they are today. The English Channel didn't exist. Britain was connected to mainland Europe by dry land. The Persian Gulf was a river valley. Indonesia, which is now thousands of islands, was mostly a single landmass connected to mainland Asia. Australia, New Guinea and Tasmania formed one giant continent, and between Alaska and Siberia, where the Bering Strait is today, this huge grassy plain called Beringia, the world map looked completely different. But it's not just that the coastlines changed. The climate was totally different. It wasn't just colder, it was drier, way drier, with so much water locked in ice and with colder ocean temperatures reducing evaporation, there was simply less moisture in the atmosphere. Deserts expanded, rainforests shrank to tiny pockets. What's now the Amazon basin was much drier, probably a mix of grassland and scattered trees. The Sahara was even bigger than it is today. Large parts of the world were covered in tundra or steppe, cold, dry grasslands with almost no trees. The ice sheets acted like giant refrigerators, generating cold, dense air that would flow off the ice in powerful winds. These winds picked up dust and silt from the exposed ground and carried it hundreds or thousands of kilometers away. Some parts of China have dust deposits over 100 meters thick that accumulated during glacial periods. The dust storms must have been incredible, blotting out the sun for days at a time. This was the world at peak glaciation, harsh, cold, dry, and windswept. And yet, life not only survived here, it thrived. The megafauna we talked about earlier weren't just barely scraping by. They were dominating these ecosystems, existing in numbers that probably matched or exceeded the density of large animals in Africa today. The mammoth steppe was the dominant ecosystem across huge swathes of the northern hemisphere. This was a type of grassland that doesn't really exist anymore, a unique mix of grasses, sedges, herbs and low shrubs that could handle cold, dry conditions. And it supported enormous populations of large herbivores, mammoths, bison, horses, reindeer, all grazing together in huge herds. Must have been an incredible sight. Mammoths were the most iconic, but they weren't the only giants. Woolly rhinoceros, just as impressive, similar in size to modern rhinos but built for the cold. They had thick woolly coats, 2 horns with the front one being absolutely massive, sometimes over 1 meter long, and they used these horns as snowplows to clear away snow and reach the vegetation underneath. We've found woolly rhinos preserved in permafrost too, just like mammoths, with their fur and soft tissue intact. And like mammoths, they show clear adaptations for extreme cold, including small ears and thick layers of fat. Giant ground sloths were dominating the Americas. Now, modern sloths are these cute, slow-moving animals that hang in rainforest trees, but Ice Age ground sloths were nothing like that. The largest species, Megatherium americanum, had an estimated body mass of 3,800 kilograms. That's heavier than most elephants. They could stand on their hind legs and reach heights of 4 meters or more. These were elephant-sized sloths, too big to climb trees, living on the ground and feeding on vegetation. And here's where it gets really interesting. We've found their burrows, actual tunnels dug into hillsides, some of them 40 meters long and nearly 2 meters wide. The walls and ceilings of these burrows have claw marks that match perfectly with ground sloth claws. Scientists think they dug these burrows either to escape temperature extremes or to hide from predators. Either way, imagine encountering a multi-ton sloth emerging from an underground tunnel. It's the kind of thing that sounds made up, but it's real. Glyptodonts were another bizarre group. These were relatives of modern armadillos, but scaled up to ridiculous proportions. They weighed up to 2 tons and walked on elephant-sized legs. Their bodies were protected by shells made of hundreds of bony plates fused together, kind of like a turtle, but much larger and heavier. The shells could be over 1.5 meters long and were tough enough to stop almost any predator. Some glyptodont species had tails covered in bony rings with spikes on the end, basically a medieval mace attached to their body, and recent biomechanical studies suggest they could rear up on their hind legs, which means these armoured tanks could stand upright and swing their spiked tails as weapons. That's absolutely wild. The diversity of megafauna during the Ice Age is staggering. In North America alone, you had mammoths, mastodons, which were a different family of proboscideans with different tooth structures, American horses, American camels, giant beavers the size of bears, stag moose with enormous antlers, and multiple species of giant ground sloths. In South America, you had even more ground sloth species, glyptodonts, giant armadillos, toxodons, which were kind of like hippo-sized rodent relatives, and macrauchenia, which looked like a weird cross between a camel and a small elephant with a trunk. In Eurasia, you had mammoths, woolly rhinos, cave bears, steppe bison, giant deer called megaloceros with antlers spanning over 3.5 meters, and more. And then there were the predators, because wherever you have large herbivores, you have large carnivores hunting them. Saber-toothed cats are probably the most famous Ice Age predator. Smilodon in the Americas had those incredible canine teeth, up to 18 centimeters long and flattened like blades. These weren't for crushing bone or gripping. They were precision killing tools. Saber-tooths would use their powerful forelimbs to wrestle prey to the ground, then deliver a killing bite to the throat or belly, severing major blood vessels and causing rapid death from blood loss. The La Brea tar pits in California have preserved thousands of Ice Age animal bones, and saber-tooths are among the most common carnivores found there. This tells us they were successful predators, probably living in social groups like modern lions, and their prey wasn't small. They were taking down bison, young mammoths, horses, giant ground sloths, big, dangerous animals. Cave lions in Europe and Asia were larger than modern African lions and probably hunted similar prey. Cave bears, despite the scary name, were mostly herbivorous, but they were huge, up to half a ton, and their size alone made them formidable. And then there were giant short-faced bears in North America, which might have been the largest mammalian land predators ever to exist. These bears stood over 3 meters tall on their hind legs and may have weighed up to 800 kilograms. There's debate about whether they were active predators or scavengers, but either way, you definitely didn't want to run into one. Dire wolves were another major predator, especially in the Americas. Real dire wolves, not the fantasy version. They were larger and more heavily built than modern grey wolves, with more powerful jaws designed for crushing bone. They hunted in packs and could take down prey much larger than themselves through coordinated attacks. The La Brea tar pits have yielded thousands of dire wolf fossils, more than any other carnivore, which suggests they were incredibly common. Even birds got in on the megafauna action. Teratons were some of the largest flying birds ever, with wingspans over 3.5 meters. They probably soared on thermals like modern condors searching for carrion, and there were even larger flightless birds in some regions. The Ice Age world had no shortage of impressive and terrifying predators. But here's what's really fascinating. All of these animals, from the smallest ground squirrels to the largest mammoths, were part of functioning ecosystems. They weren't just wandering around randomly. They had complex relationships with each other and with their environment. Herbivores competed for food and space. Predators hunted herbivores. Scavengers cleaned up the remains. Plants evolved to withstand grazing pressure. It was all interconnected. And the megafauna themselves were ecosystem engineers. Mammoths, for example, didn't just eat grass. They knocked down trees, creating and maintaining open grasslands. They distributed nutrients across the landscape through their dung. They created trails and wallows. Their actions shaped the entire ecosystem. When you have animals that weigh several tons moving through an environment, they have a huge impact. Scientists have reconstructed these ancient ecosystems using multiple lines of evidence. Fossil assemblages tell us which animals lived together in the same places. Isotope analysis of bones and teeth tells us what they ate and what the climate was like. Ancient DNA can be extracted from permafrost sediments, even from sediments with no visible fossils, and this tells us which species were present. Cave paintings created by humans show what animals looked like and how they behaved. By combining all this evidence, we can paint a pretty detailed picture of Ice Age life. One thing that's become clear is that these ecosystems weren't static. They changed and shifted as the climate fluctuated. Remember, even within a glacial period, there were shorter-term climate variations. Events called Dansgaard-Oeschger oscillations caused rapid warming spikes lasting decades to centuries, then rapid cooling again. These temperature swings affected where animals could live, what vegetation grew, and which species thrived versus struggled. The Ice Age world was dynamic, constantly responding to climate changes on multiple timescales. Humans were part of this world too. Our ancestors lived alongside these megafauna. They hunted, some of them competed with predators for resources, and adapted their own technology and culture to survive in glacial conditions. In Europe, Neanderthals had been living through these cycles for hundreds of thousands of years. They were cold-adapted, with stocky builds, large nasal cavities to warm air, and sophisticated tools. They hunted megafauna, made complex weapons, used fire effectively, and even had symbolic culture with art and burial rituals. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, arrived in Europe around 45,000 years ago. They brought new technologies, more complex social structures, and wider trade networks. They overlapped with Neanderthals for thousands of years, sharing the landscape and the megafauna. In fact, we now know from genetic evidence that they interbred. Most people of European or Asian descent carry 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. In other parts of the world, modern humans were also adapting to Ice Age conditions and living alongside megafauna in Asia, in Australia, which humans reached at least 65,000 years ago, and eventually in the Americas. The interaction between humans and megafauna is one of the most debated topics in Ice Age research, and we'll dig into that more later. But for now, just appreciate the sheer diversity and strangeness of life during peak glaciation. Standing at the last glacial maximum, looking out over a landscape of ice sheets and cold grasslands with mammoths and rhinos and giant sloths moving through it, you'd be witnessing something that will probably never exist again. These ecosystems are gone now. The megafauna are extinct. The mammoth steppe has vanished, replaced by forests and tundra. It's a lost world. But that world was the creation of the 100,000-year cycle. The cold phase of the cycle created the conditions, and life adapted to fill every available niche. For hundreds of thousands of years, this pattern repeated. Cold phase, megafauna thrive. Warm phase, forests expand. Cold phase again, megafauna come back. It was a rhythm that life on Earth had adapted to. And then, about 19,000 years ago, something started to shift. The orbital cycles were moving into a configuration that favoured warming. Northern hemisphere summers were getting stronger. The ice sheets began to melt, and what happened next would change everything. The transition from the last glacial period to our current interglacial was one of the most dramatic climate changes in recent Earth history. And caught in the middle of that transition were all these megafauna that had evolved to thrive in a frozen world. Most of them wouldn't make it through. So, we've talked about what these Ice Age giants looked like, but let's get into the details of how they actually lived, because the more we learn about these animals, the more incredible they become. Some of the discoveries genuinely surprising. Let's start with something that sounds impossible. Giant ground sloths digging massive burrows. When scientists first found these tunnels in South America, particularly in Argentina near Mar del Plata, they weren't sure what made them. The burrows were huge, some reaching 5 to 6 meters below the surface, up to 1.8 meters wide and 40 meters long. That's a 2-story house worth of tunnel, underground. Multiple mammal species were considered as possible dangers, but the evidence kept pointing to ground sloths, specifically species like Glossotherium and Celidotherium. First clue, their arm bones. Ground sloth forelimbs were designed in a shovel-like structure with unusually long second and third fingers, perfect for digging. And the bones were super strong, designed to withstand the kind of bending forces you'd get from digging through hard soil, similar to the stresses that galloping mammals put on their leg bones. Second clue, their centre of gravity. Paleontologists estimated from the skeleton that ground sloths had their centre of gravity above their hind feet, which means they could rear up into a bipedal posture. This is crucial for digging because your arms need to be free to excavate, not supporting your body weight. You can't dig effectively if you're on all fours. And the final smoking gun, claw marks on the walls and ceilings of the burrows, perfectly preserved in the fossilized tunnels. Scientists matched these marks to ground sloth hand skeletons, and they fit exactly. These sloths weren't just big, they were engineering huge underground structures. For animals weighing 800 to 1200 kilograms, this is incredible behavior. Why were they doing it? The leading theories are either temperature regulation or predator avoidance. Underground, temperatures are much more stable than on the surface. If you're trying to escape extreme heat or cold, a burrow makes sense. Or maybe they were hiding from predators like saber-toothed cats or giant, short-faced bears. When you're big but not fast, going underground where predators can't easily follow you is a smart strategy. Either way, it shows these animals were way more behaviorally complex than we might expect from something called a giant sloth. Here's another fascinating discovery about ground sloths. In Ecuador, at a site called Tanque Loma, paleontologists found the remains of at least 22 Erymatherium sloths of various ages, all in the same location. They likely died during a drought, getting trapped in a shrinking watering hole. But the cool part is what this tells us about their behavior. They were congregating at watering holes, which means they were social animals, living in groups. And they were probably wallowing in the water to escape heat and insects, similar to how hippos and rhinos behave today. Wait, wallowing during an ice age? Yeah, because even during glacial periods, not everywhere was frozen all the time. Tropical and subtropical regions still had warm seasons. The climate was cooler and drier than today, but equatorial regions weren't under ice sheets. Animals living in these areas still needed ways to deal with heat stress during the warmest parts of the year. So ground sloths in South America were using the same strategies that large African mammals use today. The Ice Age wasn't uniformly frozen across the entire planet. Now, let's talk about mammoths again, because we keep finding new things about them. The ones preserved in Siberian permafrost have given us an incredible amount of information. Some of these frozen mammoths have their last meals preserved in their stomachs. Scientists have examined this material and found grasses, sedges, herbs, flowers, mosses. This tells us exactly what the mammoth steppe ecosystem was like and what plants were available. But it gets even better. We've extracted DNA from these frozen specimens and sequenced entire mammoth genomes, and the genetic analysis revealed some wild adaptations. Mammoths had variants of hemoglobin, the protein that carries oxygen in blood, that function better at cold temperatures. Normal hemoglobin doesn't release oxygen as efficiently when it's cold, which would be a problem for an animal living in freezing conditions. Mammoth hemoglobin had mutations that compensated for this, allowing their blood to deliver oxygen effectively even when their body tissues were cold. That's hardcore molecular adaptation to cold environments. We've also found that mammoths had genes for small ears, sparse sweat glands, and improved fat storage, all coded in their DNA. Evolution didn't just change their external appearance, it rewired their physiology at the genetic level. And here's something kind of poignant. The last mammoths to ever exist lived on Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean. This island was cut off from the mainland when sea levels rose after the ice sheets melted. A population of around 500 to 1,000 mammoths survived there in isolation until about 4,000 years ago. 4,000 years ago. That's after the pyramids of Giza were built. That's during the Bronze Age. Mammoths and ancient civilizations overlapped in time. The last of these giants were still walking around on a remote Arctic island, while humans in Egypt were building monuments and developing writing. And then they went extinct, probably due to a combination of inbreeding, habitat degradation on their small island, and possibly climate change or human arrival. The end of an evolutionary line that had lasted for millions of years. Woolly rhinoceros are another species we know a lot about from frozen specimens. Like mammoths, they had thick woolly coats and were built for the cold, but their behavior was probably different. Based on their tooth wear and the isotopes in their bones, scientists think woolly rhinos were more selective feeders than mammoths. While mammoths were bulk grazers, eating lots of whatever vegetation was available, woolly rhinos seemed to be pickier, probably using their horns to dig through snow to find specific plants they preferred. The giant deer Megaloceros had antlers that were absolutely insane. The largest specimens had antlers spanning over 3.5 meters from tip to tip. That's wider than a car. These antlers could weigh up to 40 kilograms. Carrying that much weight on your head takes serious neck and shoulder muscles. Scientists think these massive antlers were primarily for display and competition between males, similar to how modern deer use their antlers. During mating season, males would show off their antlers to females and use them in battles with rival males. The bigger your antlers, the more impressive you looked, but those antlers came with a cost. Growing them required huge amounts of calcium and energy, and carrying them around was energetically expensive. Only the healthiest, best-fed males could support truly enormous antlers. Cave bears are interesting because despite their name and their size, they were mostly herbivorous. Isotope analysis of their bones shows they ate primarily plants. They were built like grizzly bears but acted more like giant pandas. They hibernated in caves during winter, which is where we find most of their fossils. Some caves in Europe have thousands of cave bear bones, representing hundreds or thousands of individuals that hibernated there over millennia. And cave bears went extinct earlier than many other megafauna, around 27,000 to 24,000 years ago, well before the end of the last glacial period. The reasons aren't entirely clear, but it might have been related to competition with humans for cave space, climate changes affecting their food supply, or a combination of factors. Glyptodonts are still blowing my mind the more I learn about them. Recent studies of their skeletal structure and muscle attachment points suggest they were capable of some surprising behaviors. They might have been able to rear up, as we mentioned, but they also show adaptations for powerful digging, similar to what we see in modern armadillos, but scaled up massively. So these armored giants might have dug burrows like their ground sloth contemporaries. Imagine tunnels big enough for a Volkswagen Beetle to drive through, created by armoured animals with spiky tails. The Ice Age was wild. The predators of the Ice Age were just as specialised as the herbivores. Saber-toothed cats didn't just have those impressive fangs for show. Biomechanical studies of their skulls show they had relatively weak bite forces compared to modern big cats, but their neck muscles were incredibly powerful. The hunting strategy was probably to use their strong forelimbs to wrestle prey down, then use their neck muscles to drive those saber teeth deep into the prey's throat or belly with precision. It wasn't about crushing force, it was about precision cutting. One good bite to sever major blood vessels, and the prey would bleed out quickly. Direwolves have been studied extensively because of how many fossils we have from La Brea tar pits. Thousands of individuals died there over tens of thousands of years, getting trapped in sticky asphalt while trying to scavenge animals that had already gotten stuck. And the fossils show interesting patterns. Many dire wolf specimens have broken teeth, healed fractures, and signs of arthritis, especially in older individuals. This suggests they lived in social groups that cared for injured or elderly members. A wolf with a broken leg or missing teeth can't hunt effectively on its own, but if the pack shares food, they can survive. The fossil evidence suggests dire wolves had complex social structures similar to modern wolves. Giant short-faced bears are still mysterious in some ways. Were they primarily predators or scavengers? The evidence is mixed. Their long legs suggest they could cover long distances efficiently, which would be useful for scavenging, but their powerful jaws and teeth could definitely kill prey. They might have been opportunistic, hunting when possible and scavenging when available. Their sheer size, potentially the largest mammalian land predator ever, suggests they could intimidate smaller predators and steal their kills. Imagine a pack of dire wolves bringing down a bison only to have a giant short-faced bear show up and chase them off to claim the carcass. One of the coolest things about Ice Age ecosystems is that we have evidence of how they functioned from an unusual source, ancient DNA in sediments. Even when there are no bones or visible fossils, DNA from animals can be preserved in frozen soil. Scientists have developed techniques to extract and identify this environmental DNA, and it's revealed which species were present in different places at different times. This has filled in gaps in the fossil record and shown us that Ice Age ecosystems were even more diverse than we realized. For example, we now know that horses were present in areas where we don't have horse fossils because we found horse DNA in the soil. We've identified plants that grew in certain regions by finding their pollen and DNA. We can even tell what the climate was like by looking at which species of plants and insects were present. It's like reading an ancient ecological record written in genetic code. Humans were observing and interacting with all of this megafauna, and they left records of what they saw. Cave art from sites like Lascaux in France and Chauvet Cave shows remarkably accurate depictions of Ice Age animals. The artists painted mammoths, woolly rhinos, bison, horses, cave lions, and more. These paintings aren't crude stick figures, they're sophisticated artworks showing animals in motion using the natural contours of cave walls to create three-dimensional effects. The artists clearly spent a lot of time observing these animals to capture them so accurately. Some cave paintings even show details like fur patterns, seasonal coat changes, and behavioral poses. There's a famous painting of a woolly rhino that clearly shows its thick fur and the way it held its head. There are paintings of mammoths that show their characteristic domed heads and long tusks. These artworks are our direct visual record of what Ice Age megafauna looked like, created by people who saw them alive. Humans also left behind butchered animal bones showing clear-cut marks from stone tools, mammoth bones with spear points embedded in them, campsites with hearths surrounded by the remains of horses, bison, and reindeer. The archaeological record proves that humans hunted megafauna and relied on them for food, materials for tools and clothing, and fat for fuel. Mammoth ivory was carved into art objects and tools. Hides were used for clothing and shelter. Bones were used to build dwelling structures in areas with scarce wood. Every part of these animals was utilized. But humans weren't just passive observers or simple hunters. There's evidence that humans might have used fire to manage landscapes, creating and maintaining the open grasslands that megafauna depended on. By burning vegetation regularly, humans could prevent forests from encroaching on grasslands, keeping habitats open for the large herbivores they hunted. This kind of ecosystem engineering might have actually helped support megafauna populations in some regions. The relationship between humans and megafauna was complex, not just predator and prey. The 100,000-year cycle had created this entire world. The cold phase of the cycle produced these unique ecosystems and drove the evolution of specialized megafauna adapted to frozen conditions. For hundreds of thousands of years, the pattern repeated. Ice sheets advanced. Megafauna thrived, ice sheets retreated, forests expanded, ice sheets advanced again. Life adapted to this rhythm. But then, about 19,000 years ago, the cycle began shifting toward warming again, and this time something was different. This time humans had spread across most of the world, developed sophisticated hunting technologies, and existed in larger numbers than ever before. This time, when the climate started changing and the ice began to melt, the megafauna wouldn't just adapt and wait for the cycle to swing back to cold like they had for hundreds of thousands of years. This time, most of them were going to disappear forever, and we're still debating exactly why. So, around 19,000 years ago, the 100,000-year cycle reached a turning point. The orbital configuration shifted into a pattern that favoured warming. Northern Hemisphere summers started getting stronger, receiving more solar radiation. And when that happens, winter snow starts melting more completely each summer. Ice sheets stop growing and begin their long retreat. The transition from glacial to interglacial conditions was underway. But here's the thing about deglaciation. It doesn't happen smoothly. It happens in fits and starts, with sudden collapses, temporary reversals, and periods of rapid change that would have been noticeable within human lifetimes. And this messiness, this is what makes understanding the megafauna extinctions so complicated. The first major pulse of melting kicked off around 19,000 years ago and continued for several thousand years. Sea levels started rising as ice sheets melted and poured water back into the oceans. During one period called Meltwater Pulse 1A, around 14,600 years ago, sea levels rose by roughly 20 meters in less than 500 years. 20 meters might not sound huge, but think about what that means. That's enough to flood vast coastal areas, submerge land bridges, and completely transform coastlines. All that water had to come from somewhere, and it came from collapsing sections of the Great Ice Sheets. The Laurentide ice sheet, that massive dome of ice covering Canada, began breaking apart. The Fennoscandian ice sheet in Europe did the same. As they melted, they left behind a landscape that had been compressed under kilometers of ice for thousands of years. The land was scraped clean, covered in glacial till, dotted with lakes formed in depressions carved by ice. It must have been a raw, bare landscape at first, slowly being colonized by plants as the climate warmed. But the warming wasn't steady. There were dramatic interruptions. The most famous, the Younger Dryas event, and this one's a wild ride. By around 14,700 years ago, the world had been warming for thousands of years. Ice sheets in retreat. Things seemed to be heading toward interglacial conditions. Then suddenly, boom, temperatures crashed. In Greenland, temperatures dropped by about 15 degrees Celsius in just a few decades. Possibly faster, some evidence suggests it could have happened in as little as 10 to 20 years. The North Atlantic region was plunged back into near glacial conditions that lasted over 1,000 years. What caused this dramatic reversal? The leading theory involves a catastrophic flood. As the Laurentide ice sheet melted, water pooled up behind it, forming enormous glacial lakes. The largest was Glacial Lake Agassiz, which was bigger than all of the modern Great Lakes combined. This lake was dammed in by the ice sheet itself. And when that ice dam failed, which geological evidence suggests it did multiple times, absolutely stupendous amounts of fresh water flooded into the ocean in a geologically instant time frame. We're talking about enough water to raise global sea levels by several meters, all released in months to years. This massive freshwater dump disrupted ocean circulation in the North Atlantic. There's this ocean circulation pattern called the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC. It's basically a conveyor belt where warm surface water flows north, cools down near Greenland, becomes dense and sinks, then flows south at depth. This circulation transports enormous amounts of heat from the tropics to the northern hemisphere, but fresh water is less dense than salt water. When you dump a huge amount of fresh water into the North Atlantic, it floats on top and prevents the normal sinking of cold, dense water. This can slow down or shut down the AMOC, and when the AMOC stops, the Northern Hemisphere stops receiving that massive heat transport from the tropics. Temperatures crash and you're back to near glacial conditions. The Younger Dryas had effects far beyond the North Atlantic. Climate patterns shifted across the globe. Some regions got drier, others wetter. Temperatures changed, and this had huge impacts on ecosystems and the animals living in them. For megafauna that were already stressed by changing habitats as the climate warmed and forests expanded, the Younger Dryas cold snap might have provided a temporary reprieve, but it also added instability to an already unstable situation. And it had major impacts on human societies too. In the Middle East, this is right around the time agriculture first developed. Some scientists think the climate stress of the Younger Dryas might have pushed hunter-gatherer groups to start deliberately cultivating plants as a way to ensure food security when wild resources became unreliable. If that's true, then this climate event triggered by the 100,000-year cycle transitioning from glacial to interglacial literally changed the course of human history, setting us on the path to farming, settled civilizations, and everything that followed. But eventually, around 11,700 years ago, the Younger Dryas ended, and it ended just as abruptly as it started. Temperatures spiked upward again. In some regions, temperatures rose by 10 degrees Celsius or more in just a decade or two. That's mind-bogglingly fast for natural climate change. The AMOC kicked back into gear, heat flooded northward again, ice sheets resumed their collapse, and this time there was no going back. The transition to full interglacial conditions was complete. We call this the beginning of the Holocene, our current geological epoch, and it marks the end of the last glacial period. For the megafauna, this was catastrophic. They had evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to thrive in cold, open grassland environments. But as the Holocene began, those environments were disappearing. The mammoth steppe, that unique ecosystem of cold grasslands that had supported enormous populations of large herbivores, was transforming. Forests were expanding. Grasslands were shrinking. The climate was getting wetter and warmer. For animals adapted to cold and dry conditions, this was a crisis. And the extinctions came fast. In North America, most megafauna disappeared between about 13,000 and 11,000 years ago. Mammoths, mastodons, horses, camels, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, giant short-faced bears, all gone within a few thousand years. That's 70 to 80% of large mammal species just vanished. It's called the Quaternary Extinction Event, and it was devastating. Europe saw similar losses, though the timing varies by species. Woolly mammoths disappeared from most of their range, hanging on only in isolated refugia like Wrangel Island. Woolly rhinos went extinct, cave lions vanished, giant deer died out. The megafauna that had dominated Europe during the Ice Age were gone or severely reduced. South America lost its megafauna too. Giant ground sloths, all the different species that had evolved there, extinct. Glyptodonts, gone. Native horses and camels, extinct. Toxodons and Macrauchenia and giant armadillos, all gone. The extinction wave swept through the Americas like wildfire. Australia had already lost most of its megafauna earlier, between about 50 and 40,000 years ago. Giant wombats, enormous kangaroos, massive flightless birds, a marsupial lion all disappeared. The timing in Australia coincides more with human arrival than with the last deglaciation, which adds another piece to the puzzle of what caused these extinctions. So what killed them? This is the question that's been debated for decades, and honestly, it's still not completely settled. There are two main camps, the climate change hypothesis and the human hunting hypothesis, and the truth is probably a combination of both, with the relative importance varying by region and species. The climate change hypothesis argues that the rapid warming and ecosystem transformation was more than these animals could handle. Megafauna had evolved for cold, open habitats. When those habitats disappeared in just a few thousand years, they couldn't adapt fast enough. As forests expanded and grasslands shrank, megafauna populations became fragmented into smaller and smaller pockets of suitable habitat. Small, isolated populations are vulnerable to inbreeding, disease, random environmental fluctuations. This creates an extinction vortex where declining populations face multiple threats that compound each other, and recovery becomes impossible. There's good evidence for climate being a major factor. The extinctions happened during a period of incredibly rapid climate change. Species adapted to cold climates like woolly mammoths and woolly rhinos went extinct, while species adapted to forests or warmer climates generally survived. This pattern suggests climate played a big role. Also, megafauna had survived previous deglaciations. The 100,000-year cycle means there were multiple transitions from glacial to interglacial conditions over the past few million years. If megafauna survived those, why not this one? That's where the human hunting hypothesis comes in. Modern humans had spread across most of the world by the end of the last ice age, and humans are incredibly effective hunters, especially with the technological innovations that developed during this period. Atlatls, which are spear throwers that dramatically extend your range and power, sophisticated hunting strategies involving coordinated groups, and later, bows and arrows. Human populations were growing and spreading into new territories. And critically, many megafauna had little or no evolutionary experience with human hunters. When humans first arrived in the Americas or Australia, the local megafauna hadn't evolved fear responses to these two-legged predators. They were naive prey. Modern examples show this pattern. When humans first reached oceanic islands with no previous human presence, the native birds and mammals often showed no fear and were easily hunted to extinction within decades or centuries. The same might have happened with Ice Age megafauna. They simply didn't recognize humans as threats until it was too late. And here's the thing about hunting megafauna. You don't need to hunt intensively to drive them extinct. These animals have slow reproductive rates. A female mammoth might have a calf every 5 years. Mammoths don't reach sexual maturity until their teens. If you kill even a few individuals per year from a population, especially females of reproductive age, you can drive the population into decline. Mathematical models show that even very low-intensity hunting, killing just a few % of the population per year, can drive large-bodied animals extinct over centuries to millennia. And we know humans hunted megafauna. We've found butchered mammoth bones at human sites, spear points embedded in mammoth ribs, kill sites where multiple animals were driven off cliffs or into traps and then butchered, cave paintings showing hunting scenes. The evidence is undeniable that humans hunted these animals. The question is whether hunting alone could cause extinctions or whether it was just the final straw for populations already struggling with climate change. The timing is really suspicious in many regions. In North America, the extinctions coincide almost exactly with the expansion of Clovis culture, a group of humans with particularly effective hunting technology. Clovis points, these distinctive spear points, are found at sites with butchered mammoth remains. Within a few thousand years of Clovis people spreading across North America, the megafauna were gone. That's awfully coincidental timing. A study of the Anzic child, the only known Clovis individual, provides some interesting evidence. This was an 18-month-old child buried about 12,700 years ago in Montana. Scientists analysed isotopes from the bones to reconstruct the diet of the child's mother, and they found that mammoth contributed around 40% of the maternal protein diet, similar to the diet of specialised mammoth predators like scimitar cats. This suggests Clovis people were heavily targeting mammoths, possibly as specialised mammoth hunters. But we need to be careful not to overinterpret. The Anzic child is one individual. We can't say all Clovis people had the same diet or hunting focus, and there's still debate about how many people there actually were. Could small human populations really hunt mammoths to extinction across an entire continent? Some scientists are skeptical. The extinction pattern also varies. Some species went extinct early, others lasted longer. Mammoths on Wrangel Island survived until about 4,000 years ago, thousands of years after they disappeared from the mainland. Cave bears went extinct before many other species. Dire wolves disappeared, but grey wolves survived. Bison survived even though they were hunted heavily. Why some species made it and others didn't is still being figured out. One thing that's clear is that the combination of climate change and human pressure was deadly. Climate change stressed megafauna populations by fragmenting habitats and reducing food availability. Human hunting prevented already struggling populations from recovering. Together, these factors created a perfect storm that most megafauna couldn't survive. And there might have been indirect effects too. Humans used fire extensively to manage landscapes, and this altered vegetation patterns. The loss of megafauna themselves had ecosystem effects. Mammoths and other large herbivores were ecosystem engineers, maintaining open grasslands. When they disappeared, the grasslands transformed into forests, making habitat even less suitable for any remaining megafauna. It's a cascade of effects, all interconnected. What we're left with is this. The 100,000-year cycle had sustained megafauna for hundreds of thousands of years. Cold phase, they thrive. Warm phase, they retreat to refugia. Cold phase again, they expand. It was a rhythm life had adapted to. But this time, when the cycle shifted to warming, there was a new factor: humans with sophisticated hunting technology and growing populations. The combination of rapid climate change and human pressure was more than most megafauna could handle, and within a few thousand years, the Ice Age world of giants was gone forever. Now let's talk about the humans who lived through these 100,000-year cycles, because their story, just as fascinating as the megafauna, and when I say humans, I'm talking about multiple species. We weren't the only ones around during the Ice Age. Neanderthals were already well established when our ancestors showed up, and they deserve way more credit than they usually get. Neanderthals were the original Ice Age survivors. They evolved in Europe and parts of Asia hundreds of thousands of years ago, been living through these glacial cycles long before modern humans ever left Africa. They weren't some brutish, primitive dead end. They were sophisticated, intelligent humans who had adapted incredibly well to glacial conditions. Their adaptations, brilliant. Start with their body structure. Neanderthals were short and stocky, with barrel chests and thick, heavy bones. The average male was only about 160 centimeters tall, but they were built like tanks, seriously muscular, with bones showing massive muscle attachment sites. This wasn't just random, it was an adaptation to cold. Shorter, stockier bodies have less surface area relative to their volume, which means less heat loss. This is Bergmann's rule in action, the same principle that made Ice Age megafauna so large. In cold climates, compact bodies retain heat better. And their faces were distinctive, large noses with wide nasal passages. This wasn't for aesthetics. Those big nasal cavities acted like built-in air conditioners, warming and humidifying the frigid, dry air before it reached the lungs. Breathing super cold air repeatedly can damage lung tissue, so this was crucial. It's the same adaptation we see in woolly mammoths with their enlarged sinuses. Different species, same solution to the same problem. Convergent evolution at work. But physical adaptations only tell part of the story. Neanderthals had sophisticated culture and technology. They made complex stone tools using the levallois technique, where you carefully prepare a core and then strike off flakes of predetermined shapes. This requires planning and mental visualization. You have to see the finished tool in your mind before you start working the stone. They also made wooden spears, carefully shaped and balanced, with tips hardened by fire. Some of these spears have been found preserved in German peat bogs, and they're beautifully crafted. And Neanderthals hunted big, dangerous game. We've found Neanderthal sites with bones of bison, reindeer, wild horses, even woolly rhinoceros and mammoth. These weren't scavenged carcasses. The bones show clear butchery marks made with stone tools while the meat was fresh. Neanderthals were actively hunting animals that could easily kill them if the hunt went wrong. That requires coordination, communication, planning, and courage. They used fire extensively and effectively, not just for warmth and cooking, but for making complex adhesives. Archaeologists have found Neanderthal tools with birch bark tar used to attach stone points to wooden handles. Making birch bark tar requires heating birch bark in the absence of oxygen at specific temperatures. This is a multi-step process that requires technical knowledge and careful control. You can't just stumble into figuring this out. They understood the process and could replicate it reliably. Even more impressive, Neanderthals had symbolic culture. They made ornamental objects, pierced shells, and eagle talons that were apparently worn as jewellery. They used pigments, possibly for body painting or decorating objects or cave walls, and they buried their dead, sometimes with what appear to be grave goods or in deliberate postures. There's a famous burial at Shanidar Cave in Iraq that includes evidence that might suggest flowers were placed in the grave, though that's still debated. But the intentional burial itself isn't controversial. Neanderthals thought about death and had rituals around it. That's deeply human behaviour. They even created art. In Spanish caves, there are abstract geometric patterns and hand stencils that date to times when only Neanderthals were present in the region. These are among the earliest known examples of cave art, pushing back the timeline of symbolic behaviour. This wasn't just one weird group doing something unusual. Similar markings have been found at multiple sites, suggesting it was part of broader Neanderthal culture. So if Neanderthals were so capable and well adapted, why did they disappear? This is one of the most debated questions in paleoanthropology. The last Neanderthals died out around 40,000 years ago, and modern humans who'd been spreading into Europe from Africa and the Middle East were definitely around by then. The timing is suspicious. We show up, they disappear. Did we outcompete them? Did we absorb them through interbreeding? Did we kill them off directly? Or was it something else? The genetic evidence is clear that Neanderthals and modern humans interbred. If you're of European or Asian descent, you probably carry 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. That might not sound like much, but it proves our ancestors and Neanderthals were having children together. And those children survived and had their own children. Some Neanderthal genes are still with us today, including variants that affect immune function, skin and hair traits, and even susceptibility to certain diseases. So at some level, Neanderthals didn't completely go extinct. They were absorbed into the modern human gene pool. But as a distinct population with their own culture and identity, Neanderthals didn't survive. Why? One major factor was probably demographics. Modern human populations seem to have been larger and more widespread. When two populations are competing for the same resources, the one with more individuals usually wins through sheer numbers. Even if individual Neanderthals were just as capable as individual modern humans, if they were outnumbered 10 to 1, they'd eventually be swamped by the larger population. Modern humans also seem to have had some technological advantages. While Neanderthals made excellent tools, modern humans developed more diverse and specialized toolkits. They made fine bone needles for sewing fitted clothing, which provides better insulation than just wrapping hides around yourself. They made fishing equipment like hooks and harpoons, expanding their food sources. They created more prolific art and ornaments, possibly indicating more complex social structures or better communication systems. And modern humans had wider trade networks. We find materials at modern human sites that came from hundreds of kilometers away, showing they were exchanging goods over large distances. Neanderthal trade networks were more localized. Trade isn't just about stuff, it's about information exchange and social connections. Wider networks mean more people sharing ideas and innovations, which accelerates cultural evolution and adaptation. Some researchers think modern humans might have had slightly better language abilities, allowing more complex planning and coordination, or maybe they had different social structures that were more effective at resource acquisition or raising children. These are subtle differences that wouldn't show up obviously in archaeological remains, but over generations they could compound into significant advantages. Climate might have played a role too. The late Ice Age was incredibly unstable climatically, with rapid swings between cold and warm. Maybe Neanderthals, who were specialized for cold, stable conditions, struggled more with rapid climate fluctuations. Modern humans, coming from Africa which had its own climate variability, might have been more adaptable to changing conditions. But this is speculative. We don't really know. What's clear is that by 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals were gone and modern humans were the only human species left in Europe. And modern humans were spreading everywhere, adapting to every environment Earth had to offer. By the end of the last glacial period, humans had reached every continent except Antarctica, and they'd done it while surviving the 100,000-year cycle at its most extreme phase. Modern humans developed an impressive array of technologies during the late Ice Age. Projectile weapons were a game changer. Early humans used thrusting spears that required getting close to prey, dangerous when you're hunting mammoth. Then they invented the atlatl, a spear thrower that acts as a lever arm to dramatically increase throwing range and power. Suddenly you could attack from tens of meters away, much safer. Later, probably between 20 and 30,000 years ago in some regions, humans invented the bow and arrow. This was huge. Arrows are faster and more accurate than atlatl darts. You can carry more ammunition. You can hunt smaller, faster animals more effectively. The bow might be one of the most important technological innovations in human history. It fundamentally changed how humans could acquire food and defend themselves. Hunting strategies became more sophisticated too. There's evidence of drive hunting, where groups would herd animals toward cliffs or into constructed traps, sites with hundreds of bison or horses that were driven off cliffs and butchered. This requires serious coordination among large groups of people. You need scouts, drivers, people positioned at the cliff to finish off injured animals, butchers, all working together with precise timing. It's complex social behavior that requires communication and planning. Fishing also became important. Humans developed harpoons, fishhooks made from bone, nets, and weirs. This opened up aquatic resources as a major food source, especially in coastal and riverine areas, and fishing is relatively low risk compared to hunting mammoth. Coastal sites show intensive exploitation of fish and shellfish, with enormous shell middens representing thousands of meals. Clothing technology improved dramatically. Those bone needles that appear around 40,000 years ago, they were for sewing fitted clothing with sleeves and closures. If you've ever tried staying warm by just wrapping animal hides around yourself, you know it's not very effective. Fitted clothing is way better at trapping body heat. This technology probably allowed humans to survive in even colder regions and remain active during winter instead of just hunkering down. Shelter evolved too. In regions with scarce wood, people built structures using mammoth bones and tusks as framework, covered with hides. These mammoth bone houses have been found in Ukraine and Russia. Some used bones from dozens of individual mammoths, representing thousands of kilograms of material. These were substantial dwellings, not temporary camps. People were investing serious effort into creating comfortable long-term living spaces. And let's talk about art, because Ice Age humans created stunning artwork. Cave paintings like those at Lascaux and Chauvet in France are justly famous. These aren't crude drawings, they're sophisticated, dynamic images of animals rendered with incredible skill and accuracy. The artists used the natural contours of cave walls to create three-dimensional effects. They mixed pigments to achieve different colours. They understood techniques like shading and perspective. Some paintings show animals in motion, running or fighting, capturing movement in a static image. But it wasn't just cave paintings. People carved figurines from ivory, bone and stone. The Venus figurines, stylized female forms found across Europe, date to this period. Some have elaborate details like hairstyles or clothing carved into them. People made musical instruments, flutes carved from bird bones or mammoth ivory. They created elaborate burials with grave goods, including thousands of ivory beads sewn onto clothing. One burial of children at Sungir in Russia included so many beads that researchers estimated it would have taken thousands of hours to make them. These people valued symbolic expression enough to invest enormous time and effort into it. Why did humans create art? Probably lots of reasons. Some cave art might have been connected to hunting magic or spiritual rituals. Some figurines might have been religious or fertility symbols. Some art was probably just for aesthetic pleasure or social bonding. The point is, Ice Age humans weren't just focused on survival. They had rich inner lives, symbolic thinking, spiritual beliefs, and cultural traditions. They were fully modern mentally and behaviourally, even though they lived in conditions we'd find incredibly harsh. Human populations during the Ice Age weren't huge by modern standards. Estimates suggest maybe just a few million people worldwide, but those people had spread across most habitable regions. They'd reached Australia by at least 65,000 years ago, crossing significant water gaps even during low sea levels. They'd spread throughout Asia and Europe, and critically, they'd made it to the Americas. The peopling of the Americas is fascinating. During peak glaciation, when sea levels were low, the Bering Land Bridge connected Asia and North America. But this wasn't just a narrow strip. Beringia was a vast region, probably thousands of kilometres wide, with its own ecosystems. And humans crossed it, probably following game animals, entering a continent with no previous human population and megafauna that had never encountered human hunters. The timing is still debated. The oldest widely accepted sites in the Americas date to about 15 to 16,000 years ago, but there are controversial sites that might be older, suggesting people could have arrived as early as 20 to 30,000 years ago. Either way, once humans were in the Americas, they spread incredibly fast. Within just a few thousand years, there's evidence of human presence from Alaska to the southern tip of South America. That's an incredible migration speed. And remember, the American megafauna went extinct shortly after humans arrived. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, horses, camels, all gone within a few thousand years of human appearance. The timing suggests humans played a major role. The Clovis people, with their distinctive spear points and apparent focus on hunting mammoths, have been particularly implicated. But it's complicated. Climate was changing rapidly at the same time. It's probably both factors working together. By the time the Holocene began 11,700 years ago, humans were the dominant large animal on multiple continents. We'd outlasted Neanderthals and other human species. We'd survived the wild climate swings of deglaciation. We'd adapted to every environment from tropical rainforest to Arctic tundra, and we'd developed incredibly diverse cultures and technologies. Despite being one species genetically, humans showed cultural diversity that no other species has ever matched. This set the stage for what came next, the development of agriculture and the rise of civilization. But that's a different chapter in the story. The point is, the Ice Age and its 100,000-year cycle was the crucible that forged modern human behavior. The technological innovations, the social structures, the symbolic thinking, all developed or were refined during the harsh conditions of glacial cycles. We are, in a very real sense, products of the Ice Age. Our success as a species was built on adaptations to a frozen world, and now that world is gone, melted away as the cycle shifted to its warm phase. The question is whether we're still adapted for the world we actually live in now, or whether we're carrying evolutionary and cultural baggage from an ice age that ended 10,000 years ago. So the 100,000-year cycle has shifted. Ice melted, megafauna mostly gone, and humans now living in a completely different world than their ancestors experienced for hundreds of thousands of years. Welcome to the Holocene, our current interglacial period. And this is where everything changes for human societies. Around 11,700 years ago, when the Younger Dryas cold snap finally ended, temperatures rose rapidly and then stabilized into conditions similar to what we have today. Climate became warmer and wetter than it had been during the glacial period. Forests expanded massively, spreading across areas that had been cold grasslands and tundra. Sea levels continued rising as the last major ice sheets melted, flooding coastlines and creating the geography we recognize today. The transformation, dramatic and relatively fast. For humans who'd been living as hunter-gatherers, this was both opportunity and challenge. On one hand, warmer temperatures meant longer growing seasons, more diverse vegetation, more predictable climate. But on the other hand, the megafauna they'd been hunting were disappearing. Those massive herds of mammoth, bison and horses that had been reliable food sources were gone or going extinct. Humans had to adapt their subsistence strategies fast or face serious problems. In some regions, people turned heavily to fishing and gathering shellfish. Coastal sites from this period show enormous shell middens and fishbone deposits. The ocean was stable and productive, providing reliable food. In other regions, people focused more on smaller game like deer, rabbits, and birds, supplemented with gathered nuts, seeds, roots, and berries. These require different hunting techniques than megafauna hunting. You can't drive deer off cliffs effectively. You need different tools, different strategies. But in a few special regions, something revolutionary happened. People started deliberately planting and cultivating wild plants. This was the beginning of agriculture, and it changed everything about human society. The first clear evidence of agriculture appears in the fertile crescent of the Middle East around 11 to 10,000 years ago. People started cultivating wheat and barley, domesticating sheep and goats. In China, rice and millet cultivation began around 9,000 years ago. In Mesoamerica, maize was domesticated around the same time, in multiple regions independently. Within just a few thousand years of each other, humans invented farming. Why did agriculture develop when it did? That's been debated forever. One theory is population pressure. During the Ice Age, human populations were kept relatively small by harsh conditions and limited food resources. But as the Holocene began and conditions improved, populations might have grown to the point where hunting and gathering couldn't support everyone. Agriculture produces more calories per unit of land than hunting and gathering, so it can support higher population densities. If your population outgrows your hunting territory, you either starve, migrate, or innovate. Some groups chose innovation. Another theory emphasizes climate stability. Agriculture requires planning for the future. You plant seeds and wait months for harvest. This only makes sense if you can reasonably predict that conditions will remain suitable for plant growth. During the wildly fluctuating climate of the late Ice Age, with events like the Younger Dryas, that wasn't a safe bet. But during the Holocene, climate became more stable and predictable. You could plant in spring and be reasonably confident summer would come and your crops would mature. This stability made agriculture viable in a way it hadn't been before. There's also a theory that the Younger Dryas specifically triggered agriculture in the Middle East. The idea is that hunter-gatherers in the Fertile Crescent had developed semi-sedentary lifestyles during the warm period before the Younger Dryas, living in villages and intensively harvesting wild grains. Then the Younger Dryas hit, and those wild grains became less productive. To maintain their lifestyles and avoid starvation, people started actively cultivating the grains, selecting for varieties that produced more food. When the Younger Dryas ended, they were already farming and just continued. Whatever triggered it, agriculture spread rapidly once it started, and it came with a massive package of changes to human society. You can't be nomadic and farm effectively. You need to stay in one place to tend crops and protect them from animals and thieves. So agriculture led to permanent settlements, villages that grew into towns, and eventually cities. These settlements required new forms of social organization. Who controls the land? How do you store surplus food? How do you defend your settlement? How do you resolve disputes? Agriculture also changed human diets dramatically, and not always for the better. Hunter-gatherers typically had diverse diets with lots of protein and varied nutrients from many plant and animal sources. Early farmers ate mostly carbohydrates from a few grain crops, supplemented with whatever else they could grow or gather. Skeletons from early agricultural societies show signs of nutritional stress compared to hunter-gatherers. More cavities from all the starchy foods, shorter average stature. Diseases associated with dietary deficiencies. Agriculture allowed population growth, but individual health often declined. Disease became a much bigger problem once humans started living in permanent settlements. When you're nomadic and moving frequently, your waste gets left behind and diseases don't have time to build up. But in permanent villages with high population densities, waste accumulation, contaminated water, and close contact with domestic animals created perfect conditions for infectious diseases. Many diseases that plague humans today, including measles, smallpox, tuberculosis, and influenza, originated in domestic animals and jumped to humans after we started living in close quarters with livestock. Farming made us more vulnerable to epidemics. But agriculture had one overwhelming advantage. It could support way more people per unit of land. A square kilometre of wheat fields can feed dozens to hundreds of people. The same area of wild land might support just a handful of hunter-gatherers. This meant agricultural societies could grow much larger populations. More people meant more workers, more soldiers, more inventors, more everything. When agricultural societies came into contact with hunter-gatherer societies, the farmers usually won through sheer numbers, even if individual hunter-gatherers were healthier and better warriors. Over a few thousand years, agriculture spread across most of the world where climate allowed it. Sometimes it spread through migration of farming peoples displacing or absorbing hunter-gatherers. Sometimes hunter-gatherers adopted farming from agricultural neighbors. Either way, most humans transitioned from mobile hunting and gathering to sedentary farming. And this set the stage for the rise of complex civilizations. Permanent settlements grew into cities. Cities required food from surrounding agricultural areas, which led to development of trade networks. Trade required record keeping, which led to invention of writing in multiple regions independently. Complex societies developed hierarchies with rulers, priests, craftspeople, farmers, and slaves forming different social classes. Organized religion became more prominent, with monumental architecture like temples and pyramids built to honor gods or rulers. Specialized occupations emerged as some people focused full-time on pottery, metalworking, weaving, or administration instead of food production. The first civilizations emerged in river valleys where agriculture was particularly productive. Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates, Egypt along the Nile, the Indus Valley in South Asia, the Yellow River in China. These civilizations developed writing, mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, all the hallmarks of complex society. And all of this happened within just a few thousand years of the Ice Age ending. The transformation from small mobile hunter-gatherer bands to cities with tens of thousands of people is incredibly rapid. But here's something important. While these civilizations were rising, there were still hunter-gatherer societies living successfully in other parts of the world. Australia's Aboriginal peoples maintained their hunter-gatherer lifestyles for tens of thousands of years after agriculture was invented elsewhere. In the Americas, many groups remained hunter-gatherers, even while others developed agriculture and built cities. In Africa, groups like the San people hunted and gathered successfully until very recently. Some still do. Agriculture wasn't inevitable or universally adopted. It was one strategy among many, one that happened to be very successful at supporting large populations and complex societies, but not the only viable way to live. The ecological consequences of the Holocene transition were profound. It wasn't just about megafauna extinction. Forests expanded dramatically, changing countless ecosystems. Species adapted to open grasslands had to move, adapt, or go extinct. Cold-adapted species retreated northward or to high elevations. Warm-adapted species expanded their ranges. The distribution of species across the planet shifted massively within just a few thousand years. And humans were increasingly shaping these ecosystems, often in ways we didn't appreciate until recently. Indigenous peoples around the world used fire as a landscape management tool, burning regularly to maintain open areas that attracted game animals or promoted growth of useful plants. This burning had huge effects on vegetation patterns. What we think of as natural, pristine ecosystems are often actually anthropogenic, shaped by thousands of years of human fire management. In Australia, Aboriginal burning transformed large areas from dense forest to open woodland and grassland. In North America, Native American burning maintained vast prairies and savannas that might otherwise have been forested. When Europeans arrived and disrupted these burning practices, ecosystems often shifted dramatically. Forests grew in where they hadn't been for millennia. Fire-adapted species declined while fire-sensitive species increased. The wilderness Europeans saw wasn't pristine nature. It was often the result of thousands of years of active human management. The extinction of megafauna also had cascading ecological effects we're still understanding. Megaherbivores like mammoths weren't just eating plants, they were ecosystem engineers. They knocked down trees, maintained open areas, distributed nutrients through their dung, created trails and wallows. When they disappeared, these functions disappeared too. Some scientists think forests expanded after the Ice Age, partly because there were no longer giant herbivores suppressing tree growth. There's even a hypothesis that megafauna extinction contributed to climate change. Large herbivores produce a lot of methane, a potent greenhouse gas from their digestive systems. When megafauna populations crashed, methane emissions might have decreased significantly. And the transformation from open grasslands to forests changed the reflectivity of the land surface, affecting how much solar energy was absorbed versus reflected. These effects were probably small compared to orbital forcing and other factors, but they weren't zero. Life affects climate, and massive changes in life can have climatic consequences. The loss of megafauna affected human societies too. For thousands of years, humans had hunted and depended on these animals. When they went extinct, it wasn't just loss of food, it was loss of materials. Mammoth ivory was used for tools, art, construction. Hides provided clothing and shelter. Bones were used for everything from needles to dwelling frameworks. The disappearance forced humans to find substitutes, which probably drove technological innovations. In a way, megafauna extinction might have accelerated the transition to agriculture in some regions. If your primary food source disappears and you can't find adequate replacement through hunting smaller game, you either starve or find a new subsistence strategy. Agriculture became that strategy. The extinctions that ended the Ice Age world might have inadvertently pushed humans toward lifestyles that would create modern civilization. The Holocene has been unusually stable compared to the climate fluctuations of the Pleistocene. Sure, there have been variations, warm periods and cold periods, droughts and floods, but nothing like the dramatic swings of the Ice Age with rapid warming and cooling events. This stability probably helped civilizations develop. It's hard to build cities and plan agriculture when climate might flip dramatically within a generation. But Holocene stability let humans make long-term plans and investments, building irrigation systems and monumental architecture that took decades or centuries to complete. Different parts of the world experienced the Holocene differently. The Sahara Desert, now a vast empty wasteland, was actually green and wet during the early Holocene. From about 11,000 to 5,000 years ago, increased monsoon activity brought more rain to North Africa. Rivers flowed through what's now desert. Lakes filled valleys. Vegetation covered areas that are now bare sand. People lived throughout the region, herding cattle and developing agriculture. Rock art from this period shows hippos, giraffes, elephants, animals that now seem impossibly out of place. But then, around 5,000 years ago, the African monsoons weakened and the Sahara dried out relatively rapidly. Within just a few centuries, the Green Sahara became the desert we know. This desertification forced populations to migrate, many moving to the Nile Valley where water remained available. Some historians think this migration and concentration along the Nile contributed to development of ancient Egyptian civilization. Climate change driving human migration driving civilization development, all interconnected. Similar stories played out elsewhere. The Middle East was relatively wet in the early Holocene, supporting agriculture and early civilizations, but droughts have repeatedly stressed or collapsed civilizations. In Mesoamerica, droughts have been linked to collapse of Maya civilization. In the American Southwest, extended droughts forced abandonment of settlements like Mesa Verde. Climate variability during the Holocene has been a constant factor shaping human history, even though the swings were mild compared to the Ice Age. And here we are now, roughly 11,700 years into the current interglacial. Based on past interglacials, we should eventually slide back into glacial conditions at some point. Different models give different predictions. Some suggest we have thousands of years before the next glaciation begins. Others think tens of thousands of years. The orbital cycles are complex and their effects don't always line up predictably. But there's a massive wild card. Human activity is now affecting global climate on a scale that might override the natural cycles entirely. We've increased atmospheric carbon dioxide from the natural interglacial level of about 280 parts per million to over 420 parts per million. That's a 50% increase in just a couple centuries. The ice core records going back 800,000 years show nothing like this. We're in completely uncharted territory. And this brings us to the big question: what happens next? So here's where things get really interesting and honestly a bit scary. We've spent this whole video talking about how the 100,000-year cycle has controlled Earth's climate for millions of years, creating ice ages and shaping the evolution of life, including humans. But now, for the first time in the history of this cycle, one species has the power to override it. And that species? Us. Some scientists think we've already delayed or cancelled the next glaciation. The extra carbon dioxide we've pumped into the atmosphere is warming the planet, makes it unlikely that northern hemisphere summers will be cool enough to allow ice sheet formation even when the orbital cycles shift toward glacial conditions. We might have prevented the next ice age from ever happening. Sounds good, right? Nobody wants kilometres of ice covering Canada and Scandinavia again. But the problem? We're not just preventing the next ice age, we're warming the planet way beyond normal interglacial conditions, and we're doing it incredibly fast. Let's talk about what we've learned from studying ice age cycles and why it matters right now. First, and most importantly, the climate system has tipping points. It's not linear or gradual. You can push the system for a while and see only small changes, then suddenly cross a threshold, and boom, rapid dramatic shifts happen. The Younger Dryas is the perfect example. Gradual warming, then catastrophic freshwater flooding, then abrupt climate reversal within decades. The system flipped states faster than human lifetimes. We're seeing similar threshold behavior today in multiple parts of the climate system. Ice sheets don't melt uniformly or predictably. They can be stable for long periods, then suddenly accelerate their melting when they cross certain points. Ocean circulation patterns like the AMOC can weaken gradually, then potentially shut down relatively rapidly. Permafrost that's been frozen for thousands of years can abruptly thaw, releasing greenhouse gases that amplify warming. These aren't smooth processes. They're systems where small additional forcing can trigger large responses, and we're pushing multiple systems toward their tipping points simultaneously. Arctic sea ice is declining dramatically. The minimum extent in summer has dropped about 40% since satellite measurements began in the 1970s. Some models suggest ice-free Arctic summers within decades. And remember those feedback loops? Ice reflects sunlight. Ocean water absorbs it. Less ice means more heat absorption, which means more warming, which means more ice loss. It's self-reinforcing. The Greenland ice sheet is losing mass at an accelerating rate, around 250 billion tons per year in recent measurements. Greenland contains enough ice to raise global sea levels by about 7 meters if it all melted. Nobody thinks it'll all melt soon, but even losing a fraction over coming centuries would massively impact coastlines worldwide. And once major melting starts, feedback effects make it hard to stop. Exposed darker rock absorbs more heat. Meltwater lubricates the ice base, making it flow faster. Warm ocean water gets underneath and melts from below. All positive feedbacks amplifying the initial change. The West Antarctic ice sheet is particularly concerning because much of it sits on bedrock below sea level. Warm ocean water is already getting underneath it, causing melting. Some scientists think major portions might be committed to collapse over coming centuries, even if we stopped warming today. If that happens, we're looking at 3 to 5 meters of sea level rise. That would remake coastlines globally and displace hundreds of millions of people. The carbon cycle is being disrupted in ways that mirror the Ice Age cycles, but reversed and much faster. During glacial periods, carbon dioxide dropped to around 180 to 200 parts per million. During interglacials, it rose to about 280 to 300 parts per million. This roughly 100 parts per million swing took tens of thousands of years, driven by natural ocean and vegetation processes. We've increased carbon dioxide by over 140 parts per million in just over a century. We're replicating the natural cycle's entire range in a tiny fraction of the time, and we're blowing past natural interglacial levels into territory Earth hasn't seen for millions of years. The last time carbon dioxide was this high was probably the Pliocene, around 3 million years ago. Back then, temperatures were several degrees warmer than today, sea levels were 15 to 25 meters higher, and the Arctic was forested instead of ice-covered. That's where we're headed if we don't change course, and the rate matters as much as the magnitude. Ecosystems can adapt to gradual changes over thousands of years. Species migrate, evolution selects for new traits, ecological communities reassemble. But when change happens in decades or centuries, there's no time for gradual adaptation. Species either move fast enough or they go extinct. We're already seeing range shifts in thousands of species, plants flowering earlier, animals moving toward poles or up mountains, ocean species shifting to cooler waters. Some species are adapting successfully, others aren't, and we're likely headed for another extinction wave. Maybe not as dramatic as the megafauna extinctions, but significant. Current extinction rates are already elevated above background, and climate change is adding another major stressor on top of habitat loss and pollution. Here's something that keeps scientists up at night. During Ice Age cycles, carbon dioxide changes were a feedback, not a forcing. Orbital variations changed sunlight distribution. This affected temperature. Temperature changes affected ocean chemistry and vegetation, which changed atmospheric carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide then amplified the temperature changes. It was a feedback loop within the system responding to external astronomical forcing. But what we're doing is different. We're directly forcing carbon dioxide changes by burning fossil fuels. This is direct forcing, not feedback. And all those natural feedbacks that amplified carbon dioxide changes during Ice Age cycles, they're still operating. They're amplifying the changes we're causing. We're pushing on a system with built-in amplifiers, and we don't fully understand all of them or where the thresholds are. Permafrost is a huge wild card. There's around 1,500 billion tons of organic carbon stored in frozen Arctic soils. That's roughly twice as much carbon as currently in the atmosphere. As the Arctic warms, permafrost thaws and microbes start decomposing that organic matter, releasing carbon dioxide and methane. Classic feedback: warming causes thawing. Thawing releases greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases cause more warming. How fast this happens is uncertain, but the potential for permafrost to become a major additional carbon source is real and scary. The ocean has absorbed about 90% of extra heat trapped by greenhouse gases so far, which has slowed atmospheric warming, but at the cost of warming the ocean itself. Warm water holds less dissolved oxygen. We're already seeing expanding dead zones where oxygen has dropped too low to support most life. Marine organisms are stressed by warming, acidification from dissolved carbon dioxide, and oxygen loss simultaneously. Coral reefs are being devastated by repeated bleaching events. These ecosystems that support enormous biodiversity are collapsing. The AMOC shows signs of weakening, though the data is noisy and doesn't go back far, but multiple lines of evidence suggest it might be slowing. If it weakens significantly or shuts down, it could cause regional cooling in parts of Europe, even as the globe warms overall. This is what happened during the Younger Dryas. Global warming could paradoxically cause regional cooling in some areas. Climate is complicated and counterintuitive. So what do we do with this knowledge? Understanding the 100,000-year cycle teaches us that Earth's climate is sensitive to relatively small forcing changes. The orbital variations that trigger ice ages are tiny changes in seasonal sunlight distribution. Yet they're enough to tip the system from one state to another when combined with feedbacks. We're applying forcing much larger and faster than orbital variations. The response will be substantial. It's just a question of how substantial and on what timescale. We also learn that climate has momentum. Ice sheets take thousands of years to grow but can collapse much faster. Once you start major melting, stopping it is difficult. Ocean circulation changes can be hard to reverse. Some changes we're causing are essentially irreversible on human timescales. Even if we stopped all emissions tomorrow, temperatures would remain elevated for centuries as ocean and atmosphere slowly equilibrate. Sea level would continue rising for centuries or millennia as ice sheets keep responding to warming already in the pipeline. This is uncomfortable to think about. We've probably already committed to significant changes even with aggressive emission reductions. Some warming, some sea level rise, some ecosystem disruption is baked in. The question is how much more we add. Every bit of additional warming makes things worse. Every 1/10 of a degree matters when dealing with systems that have tipping points. The paleoclimate record teaches us that rapid climate change is really hard on societies. Climate changes at the end of the Ice Age contributed to megafauna extinctions and forced major changes in human subsistence. Droughts during the Holocene have toppled civilizations. And those were natural variations societies had no control over. We're causing changes faster and potentially larger than natural variations. With over 8 billion people to feed and house, many in areas vulnerable to climate change, the implications are staggering. Coastal cities face flooding from sea level rise, agricultural regions face shifting rainfall and more extreme weather. Water resources are stressed by changing precipitation and glacial melt. Tropical regions could see temperatures exceeding human survivability thresholds for outdoor work during heat waves. Island nations could literally disappear. The humanitarian implications are enormous and unequally distributed. Those who contributed least to causing climate change are often most vulnerable to its effects. But understanding the problem is the first step toward addressing it. We know more about climate now than ever. We can see changes happening in real time with satellites and monitoring. We can model future scenarios with increasing accuracy, and we have technologies available that could dramatically reduce emissions if deployed at scale. Solar and wind are now cost competitive with fossil fuels in many places. Electric vehicles are becoming mainstream. Energy storage is improving. Carbon capture is being developed, though not yet proven at necessary scale. The challenge isn't really technological anymore. It's political, economic, and social. Getting 8 billion people to coordinate on emission reductions, equitably distributing costs and benefits, navigating competing interests, that's the hard part. Climate change is the ultimate tragedy of the commons. Individual actors benefit from burning fossil fuels, but everyone suffers consequences. Solving it requires collective action at a scale humanity has never achieved. Some people feel despair. The problem seems too big, change is too slow, obstacles too numerous. I get that. But humans have navigated existential challenges before. We survived the Ice Age through adaptation and innovation. We transitioned from hunting megafauna to agriculture, fundamentally transforming our relationship with the planet. We've overcome diseases, expanded lifespans, created technologies that would seem like magic to our ancestors. We're not helpless. We're just facing a problem requiring unprecedented coordination. The 100,000-year cycle will eventually resume, assuming we don't permanently alter it. The orbital mechanics haven't changed. Naturally, Earth would eventually slide back into glacial conditions tens of thousands of years from now. But we're writing a new chapter, one where human activity is a major climate driver, not just a responder. We're affecting the planet on a scale comparable to the astronomical forces that controlled climate for millions of years. No species has ever had this influence. It's both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Future geologists studying sediments millions of years from now will see a clear marker. They'll see isotope ratios reflecting massive carbon combustion, extinction signatures, novel materials like plastics and concrete in sediment. They'll recognize something unprecedented happened during this brief moment. Whether they'll also see evidence we successfully navigated the crisis, that's still open. The answer depends on what we do in coming decades. The cycle reminds us that climate is dynamic, sensitive to forcing, full of feedbacks and tipping points. It's not stable, unchanging background. It's an active system responding to inputs. For millions of years, inputs were natural. Now we're adding a new input and the system is responding. The question isn't whether it will respond. It definitely will. The question is how much we let it respond before we get emissions under control. We're living through a unique moment in Earth's 4.5 billion year history. Never before has one species understood the global climate system while simultaneously altering it. We have knowledge and power no organism has possessed. What we do with that determines Earth's trajectory for thousands or millions of years. No pressure. But seriously, the Ice Age cycles show us life is resilient. Earth has been through dramatic climate changes and life survived, adapted, thrived. Life survived the asteroid that killed dinosaurs. It survived ice ages. It'll survive this. The question is whether human civilization as we know it will thrive, or whether we'll face massive disruptions that could have been avoided with foresight and action. I started by talking about the mystery of the 100,000-year cycle and how scientists solved it through patient work. That same scientific community is now warning us about anthropogenic climate change using the same methods that revealed Ice Age cycles. If we trust the science that explained the past, we should trust it predicting the future. And it's pretty clear, we're pushing the system hard, we'll see significant responses, and the window for avoiding worst outcomes is closing. The Ice Age taught our ancestors to be adaptable and innovative. That's in our DNA. We can use those traits to navigate the challenge we've created, but we need to act collectively and quickly. The climate system has momentum and time lags. Actions today won't show full effects for decades, but inaction today commits us to changes that unfold for centuries. Every year of delay makes the eventual response harder and more disruptive. So where does that leave us? 11,700 years into an interglacial that should eventually end, armed with understanding of how climate works, actively changing it faster than natural processes typically do, the 100,000-year cycle that shaped human evolution, being overridden by human activity. We've become a geological force. The only question is whether we use that power wisely or recklessly. The answer determines what planet future generations inherit and whether they'll view us as ancestors who rose to the challenge or as a cautionary tale of a species that understood the problem but failed to act. The clock is ticking. The cycle that sustained life for millions of years is still operating in the background, but for the first time, it might not matter, because for the first time, one of the species it created has the power to override it, and what we do with that power in the next few decades will determine not just our future, but the future of countless other species sharing this planet with us. The Ice Age is over. The question is, what comes next? And unlike our ancestors who just had to survive the cycle, we have the power to shape it. That's both an incredible responsibility and an incredible opportunity. Time to see what we do with it.